Good morning. We're gonna start in about 2 minutes. Meanwhile, I'm walking to the tour starting point. And YouTube tells me that I have 5 people joining me this morning. Please don't be shy, say hello, and we will start. You can use the chat. I cannot type, as you know, but I'm able to read your messages. Hello, Satyam. Welcome. Well, I have 2 people now, it seems. Hello, Charity. Welcome. And while I'm walking to the tour starting point, let me flip the camera and we'll start. So we are in Berlin city center in the neighborhood called Mitte, the middle of the city. And to be honest, hello Lily, and to be honest with you, I think I'm so tired because I've been working for almost a month and a half without a weekend that I have confused my first walk. So I thought that we're doing the UNESCO Museum Island right now. But it turns out that we're doing the Jewish tour and the 3rd episode, uncovering the Jewish history of Mitte. That's what it is. So please let me know which one you want to do because I am able to do either of those. We can either uncover the Jewish history of Mitte or we can explore the Museum Island. Satyam, thank you. That's nice of you. And remember yesterday, we were on the terrace of the dome, all the way up there. Both sounds good. Okay. So then let's do what's planned. Let's do the Jewish tour. So the history of Berlin started, at least according to written sources, in the early 1200s. So the first written mention of the trading settlement called Berlin goes all the way back to 1237. So according to that source, the trading settlement already at that time existed on the bank of the Spree River. So here, there was nothing. So we've just seen the canal of the Spree River. So the river is in front of us. The trading settlement was growing fast thanks to the advantages of the geographic location. It was located on the crossroads of the river and land trading routes. That was important. And it was pretty much in the middle of Europe, connecting Western Europe with other parts of Central and Eastern Europe and the former states of Kiev and Rus. At that time, Berlin belonged to the province known as Brandenburg. In 1451, the ruler of Brandenburg decided to move his capital from Brandenburg to Berlin. And he chose exactly the spot to build his royal residence. The royal residence was a Gothic-style castle located on the bank of the Spree River. And of course it looked different from this beautiful palace you are looking at right now. So in the 14th, 15th and 1600s, the city of Berlin, the area of Berlin, was limited to the Spree Canal, which is over there. This was the southwestern border on one end. Here was nothing. And in the northeast, the border of the city was by the TV tower. So that was pretty much it. It was a rather small place. Well, very quiet. Almost no people, except for the ones who need to work and those who are into sports. And a quick announcement, we have 2 more days in Berlin, today and tomorrow, and Tuesday early morning. And then I'm heading back to Krakow. While in Krakow, we're going to be doing 2 new tours of Krakow. We're going to finally start the Jewish series of Krakow, and we're going to do a new part of the city walk. Also, we're going to do a new tour, a new part of the Berlin's Jewish Museum tour. Here we are crossing the Spree River. And we're going to repeat first 4 parts of the Jewish Odessa series. So all of the tours, which are based on the videos, and these are the Jewish Odessa tours, the Berlin Jewish Museum tour will be organized through Eventbrite and run on Zoom. If you need any help downloading Zoom, please let me know. I can schedule a live tour here on YouTube and we can go through Zoom and Eventbrite. So here we are on Alexanderplatz. During the time of East Berlin, this was Marx Engels Forum. And in fact, the statue to Marx and Engels managed to last till our days. And it's that black monument in front of you, featuring Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Here they are. Marx and Engels. Behind them is the Humboldt Forum, the modern wall of the Humboldt Forum, which is a reconstructed city palace, which belonged to the royal family. So up until the late 1600s, the city of Berlin pretty much ended here. The fortification wall ran across the square, which is today known as Alexanderplatz. The church next to the tower is Marienkirche. And up until the middle of the 1600s, this was a different settlement the church belonged to, outside the city walls. So although during the previous parts of Jewish Berlin series, I kept telling you that the history of the Jewish community of Berlin, and we're finally at the tour starting point, so I'm starting the proper tour. So the history of Jewish Berlin started in 1671 when the ruler who was residing over there in his royal palace, the royal palace is over there, so the ruler allowed 50 wealthy Jewish families from Vienna to settle in Berlin. They were allowed to settle in the neighborhood, which was very close to the city, but was outside the city wall. And the neighborhood started from where you see these communist era buildings. At that time, it was Spandau district, which was right outside the city wall. So these 50 wealthy Jewish families from Vienna were allowed to settle there. And that neighborhood, which is today and at that time was the Spandau district, became the neighborhood of the Jews from the late 16th to pretty much late 1930s. But according to the historic sources and written mentions, the Jews had been here before. We don't know for how long, we just know the years. And here we are in front of the red City Hall building, Rotes Rathaus, built in the late 1800s in the place of the old City Hall building. And as you may remember, these days in front of any government building or on top of any government building or a public museum, there are either posters with the flag of Ukraine or Ukrainian flags. So the Jews had been here before 1671, before these wealthy Jews from Vienna were allowed to settle here. And we are actually on Judenstraße. This street is called Jewish Street. And according to the local historians, in the 13, 14 and 1500s, the Jews were allowed to settle here pretty much on the border of Old Berlin. And that fact gave the street its current name. I mean, at that time it was Jewish Street, and still today it's Judenstraße, Jewish Street. So according to these written sources, the first written mention of Jews in Berlin belongs to the late 1200s. All we know from this first written mention is that the Jews were borrowed from woolen threads trade. That's all what's known. So the first written mention of Berlin goes back to 1234. The first written mention of the Jews in Berlin belongs to the late 1200s. We don't know how many Jews there were here. All we know is that they were borrowed from woolen threads trade. Then we also know that the Jews were here twice in the 1300s, and we just have the years 1349 and 1373. And then we know that they were here twice in the 1400s, in 1405 and 1446. We don't know how long they were here for. All we know is that they were here in these years, and usually the Jews were expelled from any towns or settlements in Europe following the epidemics of the Black Plague or famine. Probably this was the case here. We also know that at least in the 1400s, a small synagogue was over there where you see the construction spot, next to Jewish Street, which was on the border of Old Berlin, Judenstraße. And here's the bus stop, which is called Judenstraße, Jewish Street. In 1510, the Jews were here as well, but we know that there was a big anti-Jewish riot, pogrom, during which all of the Jewish houses on Judenstrasse and the synagogue, which was there, were burned down, and the Jews were again expelled from Berlin. However, some 30 years later, in 1540, the ruler allowed them to come back. Why? Because he wanted money. The Jews, upon settling in Berlin, had to pay a special tax to be able to settle. Then they had to pay a special annual tax, which was called the protection money, to the ruler. And then at some point, many more special fees were applied upon the Jews. The head of the Jewish community, the elder of the Jewish community, was appointed by the king the master of royal mint. So he was responsible for coinage, for making coins, making money, for arranging loans for the sovereign, and also for collecting protection money from the Jewish community. So since now you know where the Jewish street was, it will make more sense for you. It will be easier for you to understand why the neighborhood of the early Jewish settlers since the late 1600s was there, close to Jewish street, to the original place where the Jews had been living in Berlin. And now we're going to move up in time to 1930s, because I want to tell you while we're here a very interesting story connected to the city's Jewish history. In 1930s, here on the spot, there was a Jewish-owned department store, which was one of the largest department stores in Berlin. It was named after its founder, Nathan Israel. So the Nathan Israel department store. The history of the department store started all the way back in 1830s. That's when Nathan Israel, so the department store was here. One of the largest department stores in Berlin. So in 1830s, Nathan Israel decided to open here a second-hand store. One of the most popular trades among the poor Jews in Berlin was buying and selling second-hand clothes. So a very small second-hand store was opened by Nathan Israel here. The business went well, and several decades later, the store was expanded and occupied a 3-story building here. Around 1870s, Nathan Israel purchased here 7 buildings. At that time, the buildings were quite narrow, like the reconstructed buildings over there. So 7 buildings were purchased by him, which were here, and turned into his department store, which was named after him. In 1890s, his grandson knocked down these 7 buildings, hired one of the main city architects to build here a new, large department store. Its construction was completed in the early 1900s. It was located here, and it became one of the largest department stores in Berlin. This is how it looked. It was still named after the founder of the family business, Nathan Israel. And the department store was located right across the road from the red City Hall building. In 1933, the Nazis took it over, and all of the Jewish department stores and fashion stores were boycotted by the supporters of the Nazi government. And one of such protests happened in front of the Nathan Israel department store. Here is the photo. Then the owner of the store, and that was the grandson of Nathan Israel, Wilfred Israel, was told to lay off, to fire all Jewish staff, but he refused. In 1938, during the Kristallnacht pogrom, the department store was looted by the Nazis and their supporters. This Jewish staff was arrested and sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. But Wilfred Israel, the owner, somehow managed to bring them all back home. In 1939, the department store was Aryanized, or nationalized, by the Nazis. This was one of the last Jewish-owned department stores which was nationalized by the Nazis. The owner, Wilfred Israel, immigrated to England. Wilfred Israel became one of the main people behind organizing Kindertransport, these trains that evacuated Jewish children from soon-to-be occupied territories of Central and Eastern Europe. In 1943, he was on the airplane, which was shot down by the Nazis over the Bay of Biscay. These days, they say that his plane, and he was there with an English actor, I still don't remember his name, Satyam. So his plane was a decoy to Winston Churchill's plane. They needed the second plane to make sure that Churchill would reach his travel destination safely. Leslie Howard, Satyam, thank you. So that's the end of the story. The department store, the building of the department store, was destroyed during the Second World War. These are communist-era apartment buildings, which were built here in 1980s. Had apartments for the top people in the GDR government. And at the entrance to this quarter, which I'm sure you know by now how it's called, the Nikolai Quarter, there is this cute statue. The residence. And we're now in Nikolai Quarter, in the place where the city's history started about 800 years ago. It's named after this church, which is Nikolai Church. According to the local historians, the old trading settlement of Berlin was here at least from the early 1200s. These days, on the ground floor of these buildings, there are either stores or hotels, pubs, cafes. On the upper floors, there are apartments which belong to local residents. So let's go back to the Jewish history. We're now going to uncover the Jewish history of Berlin's oldest quarter, Nikolai Viertel. So we are on Poststraße, Post Office Street. In the 1500s, the Royal Mint was here. In 1565, the ruler appointed the head of the Jewish community, the master of the Royal Mint. His name was Leopold ben Judel. He was the elder of the Jewish community. He was also responsible for arranging loans for the sovereign and collecting protection money from the Jews. He was on good terms with the ruler, but he was not really loved by people. and had quite a few enemies among the nobility. In 1571, the ruler died, and Leopold Ben-Judel was put on trial. He was blamed for poisoning the ruler and for stealing the money. In 1573, he was killed, he was quartered, and his death resulted in the big anti-Jewish pogrom. As a result of that pogrom, the Jews were expelled from Berlin, again, for about 100 years. So they were expelled in 1573, and then almost 100 years later, in 1671, another ruler allowed 50 wealthy families from Vienna, Jewish families from Vienna, to settle in Berlin, in that neighborhood, which was outside the city gates. These Jews who were settling here in the 1700s belonged mostly to the middle class and upper class. They didn't have equal rights. They were settling in that neighborhood, which I showed you at the beginning of the tour, not far from the TV tower. But very quickly, some of them were becoming servants to the king. One of such servants to the king, Jewish servants to the king, was Veit Ephraim. He became the main financier of all of the wars of the king, which that king conducted in the period of 1750s to 1780s. He also became known for debasing the local currency. He started using 70% of copper in silver coins. But the ruler was so grateful to him that he allowed him to build his residence right in the city center, not far from the royal palace. Although at that time the Jews were living in that neighborhood on the city's outskirts. So this is the Veit Ephraim residence. Once its construction was completed in 1770s, it was called Berlin's most beautiful corner. In 1930s, when the Nazis started expansion of this road and the bridge, the facade of the palace was dismantled, and 2,500 pieces were stored in the basement of the building, which later became part of West Berlin. Finally, in 1979, when reconstruction works of this district were started, the City Council of West Berlin presented these 2,500 pieces to the City Council of East Berlin, and the building was put back together. Let's continue. So in the 1700s, mostly the middle class and the wealthy Jews were allowed to settle in Berlin. They had to pay a special tax to be able to enter through the gates. The same tax, the same fee applied to the shepherds who wanted to bring their cattle into the city for slaughtering. That was quite humiliating for the Jews, but they didn't have an option. They had to pay. If they could pay, they were allowed to enter the city gates. Most of the Jews in the 1700s were looking to integrate into the local society. They were liberal Orthodox. In 1730s, a young Jew entered the city gates. His name was Moses Mendelssohn. He was about 15 years old. I'm sure some of you know the name Moses Mendelssohn. Some of you know the name of his grandson, Felix Mendelssohn. So Moses Mendelssohn was quite poor, but he had enough money to pay the entrance tax. He was rather well educated. He spoke, besides Yiddish, he spoke German, he knew Latin, He knew French. He managed to get himself a job as a tutor in a wealthy Jewish family here in Berlin. He was smart. So soon he was appointed by the head of the family, the accountant, then the factory director, and then he became the business partner. He was also into literature and got acquainted with Gotthold Lessing. That's his memorial plaque. Gotthold Lessing is regarded as the father of modern German literature. And according to some historians, this is one of his 2 addresses in Berlin. And again, according to written sources, Mendelssohn visited Lessing here in this building in the second half of the 1700s, during the era of Enlightenment. Their friendship lasted pretty much until the death of the both. Mendelssohn wrote a philosophical essay, and he showed it to Lessing. Lessing liked it so much that he decided to anonymously publish it, and that was quite a success. Following its publication, Moses Mendelssohn received the first prize in literature and philosophy from the Royal Academy that placed him ahead of Immanuel Kant. Shortly afterwards, the Mendelssohn family received exceptional rights from the king. They were made permanent citizens of Berlin and the Kingdom of Prussia, which placed the Mendelssohn family among the Jewish elite in Berlin. That status applied to all of his family members and even to his servants. So we're now walking in the footsteps of Moses Mendelssohn, the pioneer of the Jewish Reformed movement known as the Haskalah, and the pioneer of the Jewish civil rights and equality. Here, he visited Gotthold Lessing. Let's continue. This pink building in the first half of the 1800s was one of the intellectual centers of Berlin. It was built in 1770s in the very popular at that time Baroque style by the Knoblauch family. The head of the family was the master of the wire cabinets. His son became a wealthy merchant and one of the key people involved in the Enlightenment movement here. The #1 German poet, Heinrich Heine, and it's a known fact that he is the #1 poet, but it's a little known fact that Heinrich Heine was born into a Jewish family. So by birth he was Jewish. The family was not devout, although at first he was sent to a Jewish school, but then was transferred to a Christian school. In his 20s, while studying in Berlin University, Heinrich Heine baptized, converted into Protestantism, and while being a student of Berlin University, he visited this building and the Knoblauchs. Why? Because this residence was one of the intellectual centers of Berlin in the early 1800s. And while we're standing here, let's jump up in time to the period of the Second World War. This is a reconstructed building. The original one was destroyed during the Second World War. The upper floors of this mansion were occupied by the hotel during the war. And the owner of the hotel was hiding the Jews there, and the owner of the grocery store, which was on the ground floor, was giving them food. Let's continue. And we are leaving Berlin's oldest quarter, the place where the city's history started. the place where the first Jews settled. We just don't know for how long and how many. And moving further into Berlin city center, to the neighborhood called Mitte. During the previous city walks around this Nikolai Quarter, we usually entered this neighborhood, walking down this lane. Now we're gonna exit this area, walking down this lane. And we're looking at the St. George sculpture killing the dragon. Back to the Spree River. This grand mansion was built to house the royal stables. Well, I guess the royals had to keep the horses in style. So these were originally, this was the royal stables. These days, the building belongs to the Berlin Conservatory. And the royal palace was over there, with the stables across the road. And we're looking at the, I'm sure you know by now, the largest cathedral in Berlin, the counterweight to St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican and St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And yesterday we were all the way up there, walking up and down 267 steps. If you look behind the cathedral, you can see the glowing dome of the New Berlin Synagogue, which was built in 1864 in that neighborhood, which was once dominated by the Jews. This is where they were settling since the late 16th and throughout 17 and 1800s. So the local rulers were allowing the Jews to settle here. Why? Well, mostly they needed money. Also, in the early 1600s, all German states got involved into the 30-year-old war, which brought all of them to bankruptcy and resulted in millions of human deaths. So pretty much since the second half of the 1600s, the local rulers needed to attract people to here. So that's why they allowed the French Protestants to settle in Berlin. The Huguenots were allowed to settle in Berlin. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why the local ruler allowed the wealthy Jews to settle here. Human capital, human resources, people, and money, because the Jews had to pay special taxes. So throughout the 1700s, the rulers continued letting the Jews to settle here. Although in the early 1700s, the number of the Jewish families who were allowed to settle here was limited to 200 families. But the community was growing. And at times, the kings, in the 1700s, we already got the kings here, the kings imposed special taxes upon the Jews. For example, one of the prominent kings, Frederick the Great, who ruled the kingdom of Prussia from 1740s to 1780s. During his time, he imposed a special tax upon the Jews. Those Jews who wanted to build a house or get married had to buy royal porcelain for the amount of 300 thalers. That was the annual income of a middle-class local family. So basically, that meant that only middle-class and wealthy Jews could build a house or get married. Затем there was cattle tax, was a special entrance fee which they had to pay to settle in the city. Also, since the middle of the 1700s, quite a few Jews were becoming servants to the king. We've talked about Veit Ephraim, the main financier of the Frederick the Great and all of his wars, and we have seen his mansion, but he was only one of those. Another Jewish family had the last name Itzichs, and they were tasked with building the first cobblestone road which connected Berlin and Potsdam. Well, in modern language, it can be called Autobahn. Once that road was built, the Itzich family were also made citizens of Prussia. And the son of the family who built the road got a special title, the Royal Builder. Quite a few Jews supplied different goods to the king, including textiles, fashion, and furniture. In the early 1800s, one of such suppliers was Hermann Gerson, who supplied the royals with furniture and fashion items. He had a special status in the city, and the king allowed him to open the fashion salon over here in the building, which was built by the #1 city architect, Karl Schinkel. So the royals were living in the palace, and the Jewish supplier of fashion items and furniture had his store pretty much right in front of the palace. His name was Hermann Gerson. The business, of course, was going well. And in 1840s, he built here on the spot the first purposely built department store, which was named after him, Hermann Gerson. This was the first purposely built department store and the first fashion store in Berlin. And basically construction of that first fashion store kicked off or put the start to the fashion industry in Berlin. And most of that business was owned by the Jews. These days, in place of this first fashion department store, there is the building of the Germany's international affairs. And across the road is the Friedrichswerder's Kirche church, built by Karl Schinkel. And the monument to the bears, because the bear is the symbol of Berlin. So Hermann Gerson had his fashion store right here on the corner of Werdische Markt. Let me show you how his department store looked. the first purposely built department store in Berlin. That's how it looked in 1840s, pretty much shortly after it had been built. This is the main hall, quite fancy. And this is the fashion showroom in the Garçon store in the early 1900s. In the late 1800s, his department store was purchased by another Jewish family with the last name Freudenberg. Here, the Freudenbergs, who expanded that department store. That's how it looked in the late 1800s. In terms of sales, it became the #1 department store in Berlin. In 1933, when the Nazis took it over, the business was nationalized, Aryanized. Luckily, the Freudenberg family managed to emigrate. The building was turned into the headquarters of the Nazi criminal police. That's how it looked in the late 1930s. According to the local historians, the employees of this headquarters of the Nazi criminal police were involved into developing techniques for mass gassing and euthanasia. Quite a story. From the first Jewish-owned fashion department store in Berlin to the criminal police headquarters. So the building occupied the whole block. During the Second World War, it was destroyed in the aerial bombings. And these days, in its spot, there is the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So that Hermann Garçon fashion department store opened in 1840s gave the start to the fashion district of Berlin, which started from here and went on for about 2 blocks in that direction. So this became the center of the fashion industry of Berlin. According to the local historians, in the late 1800s, about 90% of women's clothes were designed, manufactured, and sold here. And most of that business belonged to the Jews. So here were department stores, fashion stores, offices of the textile companies, and most of them belonged to the Jews. Unfortunately, most of them were destroyed during the Second World War and first replaced with the communist era buildings. Then the communist era buildings were demolished after the reunification of Germany and replaced with these nice commercial buildings and condominiums, which are quite expensive. Lucky for us, at least one building of the department store, which was built here in the early 1900s and once belonged to the Jews, managed to survive. And here it is. Built in the early 1900s in the neoclassical and Biedermeier style, it belonged to the Mannheimer family. Valentin Mannheimer moved to Berlin together with his 2 brothers in the early 1800s. At first they opened here the textile processing company, but then he separated from the brothers, got married, and he married well. He married the daughter of the women's clothes manufacturer, coats manufacturer, and Valentin Mannheimer established his own business. His objective was to build a large-scale enterprise. And he first started with making inexpensive women's coats. Remember who his father-in-law was? The manufacturer of the women's coats. So Valentin Mannheimer started making inexpensive women's coats from thick wool. That business became successful. But his idea was to build a large-scale enterprise. So he was the first one to invent the system of measurements which allowed him to make ready-to-wear women's coats in big numbers, to start mass production of ready-to-wear women's coats. The business became successful. It was growing fast. It was located here. In 1870s, he started exporting the coats to other countries in Europe and even as far as the United States. And in the early 1900s, this building was built, the new building was built for his department store, which was the second in terms of sales in Berlin. The number one was the Hermann Gerson fashion store, which was just around the corner, over there. So besides being the center of the fashion industry in Berlin, this area was also the banking sector of Berlin since the early 1800s. The Bank of Prussia was built on the street, and also one of the largest private banks was opened here by the Mendelssohn family. Remember, the founder of the family, Moses Mendelssohn, was that poor boy who entered the city and paid the cattle tax. Besides being a big philosopher, writer, and the key man behind the Jewish Reform movement, he also established a quite successful family textile business. His sons became the bankers and owned 5 buildings on the street. 3 of them were occupied by the Mendelssohn family bank. Let's continue. So in 1860s, there were about 20 Jewish-owned department stores and textile companies in this district. And so that you understand, most of the Jewish owners owned the full cycle. So from making fabric, from owning textile manufacturing companies, to making clothes and selling it in the department stores. Some owned just department stores. Some owned textile companies. But basically, in the second half of the 1800s, the Jews managed to combine 3 of the most typical trades, being tailors, and as we know, pretty much everywhere, the Jews are some of the best tailors. So the skills in textile business and setting textile processing companies, and the skills in selling first second-hand clothes, then opening department stores, and in general being quite entrepreneurial. So in 1860s, there were 20 Jewish-owned department stores and clothes companies here. A decade later, that number doubled. There were 40 of them. In the second half of the 1800s, the textile and department store owners established something similar to a modern-day holding company and a trade union. It was called Confection. This was basically a big trade union or a holding company for the fashion department store owners, textile manufacturers, and clothes manufacturers. It was established to lobby their interests, to make sure they have access to cheap loans in case they needed them, and to make it easier for them to export their goods, to enter new markets. At its peak, the Confection had 80,000 companies in it and employed 200,000 people. And lots of that business belonged to the Jews. And we're now in the center on Hausvogteiplatz, which was the main center of the fashion industry here in Berlin. In 1930s, when the Nazis Aryanized the Jewish department stores, clothes manufacturing companies, and all of the textile business, according to the stats, about 7,000 companies belonged to the Jews, and 2,700 of them were here in this part of Berlin. And the center of this business was the square, Hausvogteiplatz. About 9,000 people who were initially involved in that business were sent by the Nazis to the concentration camps. And again, according to the researchers and historians, many of them, while in the concentration camps, were forced to make clothes, to design and make clothes from the textiles, from the fabric, which was nationalized by the Nazis, or from the clothes which belonged to the murdered Jews in the concentration camps. So these Jews were forced to design and make clothes. A special term, Auschwitz haute couture, or fashion design, in Auschwitz was created. And lots of that clothes, which was made by the Jews in the Nazi camps, was sold here on Hausvogteiplatz in the department stores, which once belonged to the Jews. A few years ago, this monument was placed here in the center of the fashion industry, which consists of 3 mirrors, we're in a fashion room, in a showroom, and 3 plaques, which briefly mention the history of this place and say that this was once the center of the Berlin fashion industry, and most of that fashion industry belonged to the Jews. About the Jewish Confection, this trade union / holding company, which was nationalized, the business which was nationalized by the Germans. And once the business was nationalized by the Germans, the word Confection became prohibited by the Nazis. And this is the end of our today's walk. Thank you so much for finding the time to join me today. Thank you for your interest and your support. I hope you enjoyed the yesterday's tour, which will be repeated once we are back in Berlin in June. Also, when we're back in Berlin in June, we're going to do the boat trip, I promise. Later today, we are doing the new part of the Jewish Berlin series. We're done with, so far, with uncovering the Jewish history of Mitte, of Berlin city center and its oldest quarter. Time to move on and start exploring southwestern part of Berlin, Kurfürstendamm and Charlottenburg. Once the Jews were granted with equal rights and were made citizens of Berlin and Prussia, the affluent Jews, the Jewish intellectuals, moved to southwest Berlin, which became the most affluent neighborhood in the city. And that's where we're going to head to later today. So at 5 p.m., my time, I look forward to meeting with you, to seeing you on Kurfürstendamm, to start exploring its Jewish history. And midday, my time, but that time usually works much better for Australians, And those of you who are in Europe, I'm gonna do another walk, and I don't remember which one. I think that's the Museum Island. Exactly, that's the Museum Island. That's what I confused this morning. So I thought now I'm doing the Museum Island, and it turned out that I'm doing the Jewish Berlin, part 3. Well, the last days of my Berlin trips are usually very tough. So thanks again, thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you later today. Good night, and see you later. Bye-bye. Or have a great day.